The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
Now on that same day, 2 of the disciples were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all of this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself and all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. And when he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed, and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road, and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
I had the privilege of being in the chapel last week when our children heard the story we just heard this morning. And they had been hearing the different post-resurrection stories, like all of us have. First, they heard, of course, the Marys meeting, going to the tomb and finding it empty. And they reflected a little bit on Thomas. So knowing Jesus in the empty tomb, knowing Jesus when we doubt, and then the story we heard today, knowing Jesus in the breaking of the bread, or maybe even it's knowing Jesus as we are broken open. Anyway, the storyteller told the story, and then the children began to wonder, and I said to them, you know, I'm going to talk to the grown-ups on Sunday about this story, about the road to Emmaus, when these guys see Jesus in the breaking of the bread, and what should I tell them is the most important part of this story, or what do they really need to know? And a very delightfully precocious first grader sat and looked at the story for a minute, the picture of it, and then she looked up at me and she said, "You tell them there is a lot left to learn." So I have done my assignment. And she's right, isn't she? There is a lot left to learn. We think we know all about, you know, we think we get to, we birthed Jesus, we met him as a grown-up, he's really great, then we get mad at him and we betray him and we kill him and he rises from the dead and we can all go into summer, right? That's fine. And then we'll just do it all over again in the fall. But our sister is right. There is a lot left to learn, and I would argue particularly now that he's out of the tomb, that he's risen. Because now we can't seem to nail him down at all, even quite literally, right? We tried that, and he came off the cross and out of the tomb. We can't seem to nail him down. And I think that's a huge gift. Because if you're like me, and you're like the two folks we meet in the gospel this morning, there are times in your life when you need a companion. The first thing I think we get to learn in this story is that one constant reality that seems to be the heartbeat of the entire Bible, which is God saying, "I will be with you." And these two men, and I'm right there with them, are reminded of that today. That God in Jesus is our companion. And by the way, companion means the one with whom we break bread. A little foreshadowing, I'd say, for what's about to come. But it's interesting that when he meets them, you know, it's not when they're at their best. It's not when they're joyful and excited. This story today tells us that our companion in God meets us when we're on that road when we are hopeless, maybe. When we are really angry that life isn't the way we thought it was going to be. When we are ashamed of choices we have made that have caused us and people we love to hurt. And when we are afraid that we will never find love again, that joy is completely gone. Those are sort of road to Emmaus type times in our life. And I'm guessing that all of us have been somewhere on that road. And so it's right then that this companion comes to be with them. And he doesn't, you know, have a big splashy entrance. There's no like chorus of angels and no wise men with gifts, right? He just comes and says to them, what's going on? How are you? What are you talking about? I wonder if he sees all their disappointment. I wonder if he sees their confusion or their shame or their anger or their fear. But he wants to be close to them, to be their companion. What are you talking about? And then they share with him. We had hoped. One of my favorite authors says that's probably the saddest phrase in the human language. We had hoped. We had hoped he would be the Messiah. We had hoped he would be the one that would save us. We had hoped that because of him, everything would be different. And we would not be enslaved in a way of life that keeps us from being alive, that keeps us from loving, that keeps us from joy, that keeps us from closeness with God and one another. We had hoped, but we were wrong because it's all over completely. And then their companion says, "You have absolutely missed the point. It's not over at all. This has happened just the way it should." Because don't you remember the Hebrew Scriptures and how we're told that We will meet the Christ not in our triumphs, not as one who comes and dominates and takes over, not in someone that has us then become puppets in some plan of God's master plan of making the world the way it is. We will meet the Christ in the times that we feel like we have lost. We will meet the Christ not in Superman, but in a suffering servant. Now, if you're like me, there's a part of you that's thinking, well, not so much that's a good idea. How about the first plan? But there is a lot left to learn. This story tells us today we meet our companion, we meet Christ in the suffering servant. And that, for these men, is such good news that they want to hear more. And the story tells us that their hearts began to burn. And when they finally get to the place where they're going to have dinner, they don't want the stranger to leave because they're listening differently. Wait a minute, what? You mean I might meet Christ in the times when I am afraid? You mean those things that I have done that have filled me with so much shame I can barely even look in the mirror are times when love might be there? Do you mean that I don't have to be crippled by my anger because the soothing salve of love of God is there to anoint me? What are you saying, stranger? That we don't need to avoid and hide from and run away from all that we had hoped and that we see is gone? That those are times when God breaks through? So he breaks open the scriptures, and then he seems to break open their hearts. And so they say, please stay. And then I find it kind of curious that, I don't know, I think maybe if Jesus were invited to a party up here, he's a rather rude host in this moment because he's invited to dinner and he quickly takes over. Did you notice? Like nobody else is there, you know, it's their table, their food, and he picks up the bread and he begins to take it and break it, take it and bless it. In other words, offer thanks for it and then break it. And then they see him. This same first grader said, oh, right, because they're remembering the Last Supper in the upper room. And then as I began to do the Eucharist, she was saying, take, eat, remember this. She was saying the Eucharistic prayer with me. I cannot make this up. These children, everyone needs to go to chapel. And I said, that's right. They probably are remembering that. And then one 4-year-old kept looking at the picture of the three gathered there at the meal and was looking at the bread and looking back and forth. And I said, what is most important to you? And she said, tell them the bread is the most important. And then she looked at the image of Jesus' hand holding the bread, and there's a blood stain where the nail had been. And she pointed this, said, tell them this too. This is important, and this is important. She kept going back and forth. This is important, and this is important. And then she was saying things, I love 4-year-old talk, because it is remembering me about Jesus, not reminding me, remembering me about Jesus. This is important and this is important. And then she almost in a whisper said, because they're the same thing. There is so much left to learn. It is the same thing. They see Jesus in the breaking of the bread because maybe in that moment they realized, oh, it's only in him being broken that all of our brokenness can be brought into something whole and beautiful. It is in his suffering that our suffering is joined and that we are bound together. And isn't it just like him to model it for us? If you want to be fed, if you want to be whole, the bread can't stay one. It has to be offered. Our life has to be offered. The bread has to be, we give thanks, we give praise for our life, and then it is broken open, and only then, when it's torn apart, can it be shared among everybody. And when all of us share it, then the loaf then the body becomes one again. You're going to see in just a minute the broken bread, and in that we get to experience the broken body and blood of Christ, and we get to experience our brokenness, and we get to share it, and then we get to be made whole. The minute they saw him, they rushed out and ate. They rushed out into community to be together, to say, there's so much left to learn. We saw him, we knew something about him when we were lonely and afraid on this road, and then we began to know something more as he was breaking us open, and then finally, when we saw his brokenness and our broken heart as one, we were able to see him completely, and we are able to share. Today we begin the first of our Easter People series, which I think is probably everyone's favorite 2 Sundays that we have here. And my guess is we're going to hear stories of people talking about how, in some way, their heart was broken open, and still love was shared, and they were put back together. And not because they were off away somewhere by themselves, but because they were on a road with a companion, and a holy companion showed up. And then somehow in this place where there is so much left to learn, they were able to offer their life, give thanks for it, let it be broken and shared. And that's what we need to do. We're really good about being together and loving one another, but we can't just have our Easter People moments be among us. We're called to go out, to be in a world where other people are walking on their own road to Emmaus, and to be brave enough to be the suffering servant, that love of God, to be their companion, to not be afraid of their wounds, to show them ours, and to walk with them and say, you know what? Don't stop. There's so much left to learn.